What if the most painful thing in Journey to the West was never a punishment at all? That sounds backwards. We are conditioned to believe that pain is the enemy, that freedom means fewer restrictions, fewer obligations, fewer boundaries. The modern world repeats the same promise every day: remove the pressure, remove the discomfort, remove the resistance, and you will finally be free. But what if that promise is exactly what keeps people trapped? Because hidden inside one of the most misunderstood symbols in Journey to the West is a disturbing question, one that has nothing to do with mythology, supernatural powers, or ancient legends. It is a question about human nature itself. Why does the mind rebel against discipline? Not occasionally. Not sometimes. Almost automatically. Think about it. Most people say they want growth. They want mastery. They want wisdom, focus, success, inner peace. Yet the moment a structure appears that could actually transform them, something inside begins to resist. Procrastination appears. Excuses emerge. Motivation fades. The mind suddenly becomes a lawyer defending its own limitations. Why? Because the greatest threat to the ego is not failure. It is transformation. And that is where the deeper symbolism begins. The golden headband is often interpreted as a symbol of control. A restriction. A limitation imposed from the outside. But what if that interpretation only captures the surface layer? What if the symbol was never about external authority, but about an internal conflict that every human being experiences? The conflict between who you are and who you could become. That conflict is uncomfortable. In fact, it may be one of the most uncomfortable experiences a person can face. Because transformation demands something that the ego hates. It demands surrender. Not surrender to another person. Not surrender to a system. Surrender to reality. A reality that refuses to bend itself around our impulses, our pride, our cravings, and our self-deceptions. Here is the paradox. The ego interprets discipline as imprisonment. Wisdom interprets discipline as preparation. The ego sees a boundary. Wisdom sees a path. The ego feels pain and asks, "Why is this happening to me?" Wisdom feels pain and asks, "What is this trying to teach me?" That difference changes everything. And suddenly the symbol becomes far more relevant than many people realize. Because modern life may have removed many external restraints, yet millions of people have never felt less free. We live in an age of unlimited entertainment, unlimited distraction, unlimited stimulation. We can scroll endlessly, consume endlessly, react endlessly. We have more choices than any civilization in history. Yet anxiety rises. Attention fractures. Self-control weakens. And a strange contradiction emerges. The more freedom we gain externally, the more difficult it becomes to govern ourselves internally. That contradiction points toward a deeper possibility. Maybe freedom is not the absence of limits. Maybe freedom begins when something higher than impulse takes command. Maybe the real prison was never outside. Maybe it was always inside. Remember this image. A crown that hurts. A symbol that appears restrictive. A force that seems to take freedom away. And yet somehow leads toward liberation. That is not merely a religious symbol. It is a psychological map. It is a mirror. And if that is true, then a far more unsettling question emerges. What if the suffering we spend our lives trying to escape is not always a punishment? What if, in some cases, it is the very mechanism through which transformation begins? And if that is true, then we must look beyond the surface meaning of the golden headband itself, because what it appears to be and what it actually represents may be two completely different things. If the golden headband represents something deeper than punishment, then we have to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the real conflict was never between freedom and control. Maybe it was between two completely different definitions of freedom. Because human beings often use the same word to describe two opposite realities. One kind of freedom says, "I can do whatever I want." The other says, "I am no longer controlled by whatever I want." At first glance, they sound similar. But psychologically, spiritually, and even socially, they lead in radically different directions. And that distinction may be hidden at the center of this symbol. Consider what happens when desire becomes the highest authority in a person's life. The mind begins to treat every impulse as a command. Every craving feels urgent. Every emotion feels true. Every resistance feels unnecessary. Yet something strange happens. The more authority desire gains, the less freedom the individual often experiences. This is one of the oldest paradoxes in human nature. A person can possess unlimited choices and still become a prisoner. Not a prisoner of laws. Not a prisoner of other people. A prisoner of impulse. That is why the deeper symbolic function of the Golden Headband becomes so fascinating. It does not represent an external enemy. It represents a limit placed upon chaos. And chaos, in Buddhist thought, rarely begins outside the world. It begins inside the mind. That idea feels almost offensive to the modern ego. Because the modern ego prefers a different story. It wants suffering to have a villain. It wants frustration to come from society, circumstances, bad luck, unfair systems, difficult people, or external obstacles. Sometimes those factors are real. But what if some forms of suffering emerge from a source much closer? What if the greatest obstacle to liberation is not oppression, but attachment? This is where the symbolism deepens. The Golden Headband is not simply connected to discipline. It is connected to attachment. Attachment to identity. Attachment to pride. Attachment to being right. Attachment to the version of ourselves we desperately want to preserve. And suddenly another contradiction appears. The ego often fights hardest against the very thing that could heal it. Think about how people react when a belief is challenged. When a habit is exposed. When a weakness becomes visible. When a comfortable illusion begins to crack. The immediate response is rarely gratitude. It is resistance. Defensiveness. Avoidance. Rationalization. The mind protects its current identity, even when that identity is creating suffering. That is a profound psychological mystery. A crown that hurts. A limit that protects. A discomfort that teaches. These are not just symbols from an ancient spiritual tradition. They are patterns that appear every day. In relationships. In leadership. In addiction. In personal growth. In every attempt to become someone different from who we were yesterday. And the consequences become larger than most people realize. At the level of an individual, resistance delays growth. At the level of a family, resistance repeats dysfunction. At the level of a society, resistance can transform freedom into collective chaos. This is the scale shift that many people miss. What appears to be a personal struggle is often a civilizational struggle. A culture that rejects all discipline may eventually lose the ability to govern itself. A person who rejects all limits may eventually lose the ability to govern themselves. The pattern is the same. Only the scale changes. And this raises an even deeper question. If the purpose of spiritual discipline is not obedience, but liberation, then why does it feel so painful when it first appears? Why does every transformative force seem to arrive wearing the face of discomfort? Perhaps because something is being threatened. But what exactly is being threatened? Is it freedom? Or is it the illusion of freedom? Because if the Golden Headband is ultimately a symbol of inner law rather than external control, then we have not yet reached its deepest layer. We still have to explore the possibility that the thing being constrained was never the true self at all. And if that is true, then who or what is actually resisting? If something inside us is resisting transformation, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is fighting back? Most people assume the answer is simple. They think the obstacle is laziness, weakness, lack of willpower, or insufficient motivation. But those explanations are often too shallow. Because resistance appears even in highly capable people. It appears in intelligent people. Disciplined people. Successful people. Sometimes the stronger the individual, the more sophisticated the resistance becomes, which suggests that the real conflict is happening at a deeper level. Not between strength and weakness, but between identity and reality. This is where the symbolic role of the golden headband becomes far more unsettling. Its function is not merely to create pressure. Its function is to expose something. To reveal the gap between who we believe we are and what we actually are. And that revelation can feel threatening. Because human beings do not merely become attached to possessions, achievements, or relationships. They become attached to self-images. The image of being right. The image of being independent. The image of being exceptional. The image of being in control. In Buddhist philosophy, attachment is often misunderstood as desire alone. But attachment can also take the form of identity. An identity can become one of the most difficult prisons to escape. Not because it is imposed from outside. Because it is defended from within. This creates a profound contradiction. People often say they want truth. Yet when truth threatens identity, many choose comfort instead. People say they want growth. Yet when growth requires the death of an old self-concept, resistance suddenly appears. Not physical resistance. Psychological resistance. The invisible force that protects yesterday's version of ourselves. That protection feels reasonable. Even noble. But over time it produces consequences that are rarely noticed in the moment. Because every avoided truth accumulates. Every protected illusion accumulates. Every postponed transformation accumulates. And eventually those accumulated fragments become a worldview. A life. A destiny. This is why the symbolism cannot remain at the level of an individual. The pattern scales upward. A person can become attached to an identity. A group can become attached to an ideology. A society can become attached to a narrative. A civilization can become attached to an illusion about itself. The mechanism remains the same. Only the size changes. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Not merely in politics or institutions, but in human consciousness itself. The greatest collapses often begin long before any visible crisis appears. They begin when a system loses the ability to confront reality. That is true for individuals. That is true for cultures. That may even be true for entire civilizations. And suddenly the golden headband starts to represent something larger than discipline. It becomes a symbol of corrective friction. The force that interrupts self-deception. The force that refuses to let illusion become permanent. A crown that hurts. A limit that protects. A pressure that reveals. These images matter because they point toward a hidden spiritual principle. Without friction, illusion expands. Without correction, attachment deepens. Without challenge, the ego mistakes itself for truth. And that may be the deepest danger of all. Because the shadow function of the ego is not arrogance alone. It is imitation. The ego constantly imitates wisdom. It imitates freedom. It imitates understanding. It imitates awakening. That is what makes it difficult to detect. A person can feel enlightened while becoming more trapped. A person can feel free while becoming more dependent. A person can feel powerful while becoming more fragile. The contradiction is astonishing. The very faculty that seeks liberation may also manufacture the illusion that liberation has already been achieved. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the greatest obstacle on the path is not ignorance? What if it is false certainty? What if the deepest prison is not knowing too little, but believing there is nothing left to learn? Remember another image. Not a prison made of iron. A prison made of certainty. Not chains around the body. Chains around perception. Not a wall that blocks movement. A story that blocks transformation. And if that is true, then the symbol points toward an even deeper mystery. Perhaps the force being constrained was never the authentic self. Perhaps it was only the illusion pretending to be the self. But if that is the case, then an even more difficult question emerges. If suffering exposes illusion, why does the mind work so desperately to protect it? If the mind protects illusion so fiercely, then perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the real mystery is not why suffering exists. Perhaps the real mystery is why suffering so often appears at the exact point where illusion can no longer survive. That distinction changes the entire landscape. Because the deeper symbolic function of the golden headband is not merely restraint, correction, or pressure. Its deeper function is revelation. Not revelation about the world. Revelation about the self. More specifically, revelation about the gap between the self we perform and the self we actually inhabit. This is where the symbol enters a completely different dimension. Most people assume transformation happens when new knowledge is acquired. Learn more. Read more. Understand more. Accumulate more wisdom. But many spiritual traditions point toward a far less comfortable possibility. The greatest transformations do not begin with addition. They begin with subtraction. Something must be removed. A distortion. An attachment. A false center. A story. A crown that hurts. A pressure that reveals. A limit that uncovers what was hidden. These are not symbols of punishment. They are symbols of exposure. And exposure is rarely pleasant. Because exposure forces a confrontation between reality and self-image. The moment that confrontation begins, the psychological function of the symbol becomes visible. It interrupts self-deception. Not through argument. Not through persuasion. Through experience. This is why purely intellectual understanding often fails to produce meaningful change. A person may understand truth conceptually while continuing to live inside illusion psychologically. The mind can agree with a lesson long before the heart accepts it. And the heart can accept it long before behavior reflects it. This creates a hidden contradiction inside human development. People often believe awareness is transformation. Yet awareness alone changes very little. Transformation begins when awareness becomes surrender. Not surrender to authority. Not surrender to ideology. Surrender to reality itself. This is where the spiritual function of the symbol emerges. The golden headband represents a force that continually returns attention to reality whenever the mind attempts to escape into illusion. In Buddhist thought, suffering is often not the opposite of awakening. It is one of the mechanisms through which awakening becomes possible. That idea sounds strange in a culture obsessed with comfort. But comfort and liberation are not always the same thing. Sometimes comfort protects a prison. Sometimes discomfort reveals an exit. That is why the symbol becomes larger than personal development. Its implications extend beyond individual psychology. Consider what happens when an entire society loses its relationship with corrective friction. When every discomfort is viewed as an enemy. When every limitation is viewed as oppression. When every challenge is viewed as unfair. The collective capacity for transformation begins to weaken. Not because people become evil. Because they become fragile. A civilization can become trapped inside the same pattern that traps an individual. Avoidance replaces confrontation. Narratives replace reality. Identity replaces truth. And eventually illusion becomes institutionalized. This is the scale shift hidden inside the symbol. What appears to be an internal struggle is also a cultural struggle. What appears to be a spiritual principle is also a civilizational principle. The pattern repeats at every level. A person. A family. A community. A nation. A civilization. The same law continues to operate. Whatever cannot be questioned eventually becomes dangerous. Whatever cannot be challenged eventually becomes distorted. Whatever cannot be surrendered eventually becomes an idol. Remember that image. Not chains around the body. Not walls around a prison. A mirror. A mirror so clear that illusion becomes difficult to maintain. That may be the most unsettling interpretation of all. Because it suggests that the symbol was never designed to create weakness. It was designed to reveal weakness that already existed. Not to create attachment. To expose attachment. Not to create suffering. To uncover suffering that had been hidden beneath pride, certainty, and self-protection. And that revelation leads to a question far deeper than personal discipline. If the symbol functions as a mirror rather than a restraint, if its deepest purpose is exposure rather than punishment, then perhaps the most important issue is no longer what it limits. Perhaps the most important issue is what it reveals. Because once illusion begins to dissolve, another mystery emerges from beneath it. If the false self is not who we truly are, then what remains when the illusion finally falls away? If something remains after illusion falls away, then we have finally arrived at the question hidden beneath every other question. What is the true purpose of the struggle? Not the struggle for achievement. Not the struggle for status. Not even the struggle for self-improvement. The deeper struggle. The one hidden beneath identity, attachment, and suffering itself. And this is where the symbol reveals its most profound meaning. The ultimate purpose was never obedience. It was alignment. Alignment between reality and consciousness. Alignment between wisdom and action. Alignment between what a human being is and what a human being could become. This is the core revelation. The golden headband is not fundamentally a symbol of restriction. It is a symbol of misalignment becoming impossible to ignore. That is why the experience associated with it feels uncomfortable. Because every form of transformation begins with the recognition that something is out of harmony. A musician cannot create beautiful music without hearing what is out of tune. A navigator cannot correct a course without recognizing deviation. A person cannot awaken while remaining perfectly comfortable inside illusion. The symbol points toward the same principle. Not punishment. Correction. Not domination. Alignment. Not humiliation. Integration. That distinction changes everything. Because the deeper human nature layer hidden within this archetype is that most people do not actually seek truth first. They seek confirmation. They seek reassurance. They seek continuity. The ego wants a world that validates its existing structure. Wisdom wants a world that reveals reality, even when reality is uncomfortable. This creates one of the great paradoxes of human existence. The very force that feels threatening to the ego may be beneficial to the soul. The very experience that feels like loss may create freedom. The very pressure that feels restrictive may remove a deeper form of bondage. This is why the symbol cannot be understood without connecting desire, attachment, illusion, power, suffering, transformation, and awakening into a single system. Desire creates movement. Attachment creates fixation. Illusion protects attachment. Power reinforces illusion. Suffering exposes illusion. Transformation begins when illusion weakens. Awakening emerges when attachment loses its authority. Seen from this perspective, suffering is not the final destination. It is the turning point. A bridge. A threshold. A signal. A crown that hurts. A mirror that exposes. A compass that corrects. These are not separate images. They are three views of the same reality. And perhaps that is what most people miss. They see suffering and immediately ask how to escape it. Rarely do they ask what it is revealing. They see discomfort and immediately seek relief. Rarely do they ask what misalignment is being illuminated. This is not because people are weak. It is because the mind evolved to avoid pain, not necessarily to discover wisdom. Yet spiritual traditions repeatedly point toward the same observation. The path to awakening does not move around reality. It moves through reality. Not through fantasy. Not through self-deception. Not through comforting narratives. Through direct encounter. That principle scales far beyond individual development. Entire organizations fail when they become incapable of confronting reality. Entire societies decline when narratives become more important than truth. Entire civilizations weaken when comfort becomes more sacred than wisdom. The pattern repeats endlessly because the underlying structure remains unchanged. What is true psychologically is often true culturally. What is true culturally is often true spiritually. And what is true spiritually often reveals something fundamental about human nature itself. The legacy of this symbol is not discipline alone. Its legacy is the reminder that growth requires alignment with reality. Without that alignment, talent becomes dangerous. Power becomes corrupting. Knowledge becomes pride. Freedom becomes self-destruction. With that alignment, the same forces become vehicles for wisdom. Remember those images. A crown that hurts. A mirror that exposes. A compass that corrects. Together they form a map. Not a map of behavior. A map of transformation. And that map leads toward a consequence that is much larger than personal growth. Because if awakening depends on alignment with reality, then what happens to individuals, cultures, and civilizations that spend their entire existence running from reality? And more importantly, what kind of freedom remains available to those who never discover the difference between comfort and truth? What remains after a revelation is often more important than the revelation itself. Because insight, by itself, changes nothing. A person can hear a profound truth and continue living exactly the same way. A society can recognize a danger and still move toward it. A civilization can understand a principle and fail to embody it. The real question is not whether reality has been revealed. The real question is what happens after the revelation arrives. And that is where consequence becomes legacy. The symbolic legacy of the Golden Headband is not found in the moment of correction. It is found in what that correction makes possible afterward. Once alignment with reality begins, the function of the archetype changes. At first, it appears as resistance. Then it appears as pressure. Later, it becomes guidance. Eventually, it becomes something even more subtle. An internal compass. This transformation represents one of the most important shifts in human development. The force that once felt external becomes internalized. The force that once felt restrictive becomes self-directed. The force that once felt painful becomes wisdom. That is the psychological legacy hidden within the symbol. Not obedience. Self-governance. Not dependence. Inner authority. Not control imposed from above. Order emerging from within. This distinction matters because every mature human being eventually faces the same challenge. How do you remain aligned with reality when no one is watching? How do you maintain integrity when external pressure disappears? How do you continue growing when there is no immediate reward? These questions reveal whether transformation has truly occurred. Because external structures can guide behavior. Only internal structures can sustain it. This is why the symbol extends far beyond personal discipline. Its influence reaches into families, institutions, cultures, and entire civilizations. Every functioning system depends on some form of internalized responsibility. A family survives when individuals willingly accept duties that cannot be enforced every moment. A community survives when trust becomes stronger than constant surveillance. A society survives when enough people choose self-restraint over impulse. A civilization survives when wisdom remains more influential than appetite. When these internal foundations weaken, consequences begin to spread. Not all at once. Gradually. Almost invisibly. Attention becomes fragmented. Commitment becomes fragile. Meaning becomes transactional. Short-term satisfaction begins replacing long-term purpose. And eventually a culture starts consuming the very foundations that sustain it. This pattern is not merely historical. It is deeply modern. Many people today possess extraordinary freedom yet struggle with direction. Many possess information yet lack clarity. Many possess opportunity yet feel disconnected from meaning. The paradox continues. The external world expands while the inner world contracts. And this is where the symbolic legacy becomes increasingly relevant. A crown that hurts. A mirror that exposes. A compass that corrects. Each image points toward a different stage of development. The crown represents confrontation. The mirror represents recognition. The compass represents orientation. Together they form a complete psychological journey. But there is another layer. A deeper spiritual legacy. In many philosophical traditions, suffering is not considered meaningful because pain itself possesses value. Pain alone teaches nothing. Many people suffer without growing. Many cultures suffer without learning. Many individuals repeat the same patterns for decades. The difference is not suffering. The difference is relationship. Whether suffering becomes bitterness or wisdom depends on what emerges afterward. This may be the most important consequence of all. The symbol suggests that transformation is not measured by how much pain a person experiences. It is measured by what the person becomes through that experience. That idea reshapes how we view growth, failure, adversity, and even success. Because success without transformation can reinforce illusion. Failure with transformation can generate wisdom. The deeper issue is never the event itself. It is the consciousness that emerges from it. And that realization leaves behind an unusual legacy. Not a rule. Not a commandment. Not a technique. A question. A question that continues to echo long after the symbol disappears. If the purpose of struggle is not punishment but transformation. If the purpose of correction is not control but alignment. If the purpose of suffering is not pain but awakening. Then perhaps the greatest danger was never suffering itself. Perhaps the greatest danger has always been the refusal to learn from it. And if that is true, then one final mystery remains. Why do some people emerge from hardship with greater wisdom, while others emerge from the same experience more deeply trapped than before? Perhaps that is why this symbol continues to survive long after its original setting, long after the characters, long after the journey itself. Because it was never ultimately about a particular place, a particular moment, or a particular figure. It points toward something that every human being encounters sooner or later. The moment when life stops asking what we want and begins asking who we are becoming. That question follows us everywhere. It follows us through success and failure. Through ambition and disappointment. Through youth, maturity, and old age. It follows individuals. It follows societies. It follows civilizations. And it follows us because there is a difference between changing our circumstances and transforming our nature. Many people spend their lives pursuing the first while rarely confronting the second. Yet the deepest layer of this archetype suggests that human suffering is often connected to this very distinction. Not because suffering is inherently noble. Not because hardship automatically produces wisdom. But because moments of friction reveal what comfort allows us to ignore. They reveal where attachment still hides. They reveal where illusion still survives. They reveal where identity remains dependent on things that cannot last. And in that sense, the legacy of this symbol is neither fear nor obedience. Its legacy is remembrance. The remembrance that freedom without self-knowledge can become confusion. That power without awareness can become blindness. That desire without understanding can become captivity. And that transformation begins not when reality changes, but when our relationship to reality changes. Remember the images that have echoed throughout this journey. A crown that hurts. A mirror that exposes. A compass that corrects. Each image appears different. Yet all three point toward the same truth. There are forces in life that seem to oppose us while quietly serving us. There are experiences that feel like obstacles while secretly functioning as invitations. There are moments that appear to diminish us while preparing us for a larger form of freedom. The tragedy is that these moments are often misunderstood. The gift is that they can be recognized. Not immediately. Sometimes only years later. Sometimes only after an entire chapter of life has ended. But when they are finally understood, their meaning changes. What once looked like restriction reveals itself as guidance. What once looked like loss reveals itself as refinement. What once looked like resistance reveals itself as direction. And perhaps that is the deepest spiritual implication of all. The human journey may not be a process of becoming something entirely new. It may be a process of removing what was never truly us. Removing illusions. Removing false certainties. Removing attachments that quietly shape our perception of reality. Until something simpler remains. Something quieter. Something more difficult to describe. Not a stronger ego. Not a more impressive identity. Not a perfected image. But a clearer relationship with truth. And maybe that is why this question never completely disappears. Because every generation faces it again. Every culture faces it again. Every individual faces it again. The forms change. The symbols change. The circumstances change. Yet the underlying challenge remains remarkably familiar. How much of what we call freedom is actually freedom? And how much of it is simply the comfort of remaining exactly as we are? Because if the greatest obstacles were never outside us, and the deepest transformation begins only when illusion loosens its grip, then perhaps the final mystery is not why suffering appears on the path. Perhaps the final mystery is this: when everything false finally falls away, do we discover freedom? Or do we discover the self that freedom was waiting for all along?